Welcome to this week's Resilience by Default Deep Dive podcast. Today, we're diving into an explainer that honestly flips the script on how we need to view modern cybersecurity and executive responsibility. We're looking closely at the accelerated threats brought on by frontier AI, and more importantly, the entirely new mandate this drops directly onto the shoulders of organizational leadership. If you're in the C-suite, sitting on a board, or advising them, you really need to pay close attention to this, because the old rules of cyber defense, they simply no longer apply.
Terry's article just completely strips away any illusion of safety we might still be clinging to. Back in the day, if a vulnerability was discovered, organizations historically had weeks, maybe even months to patch it up. It was kind of like having a leisurely head start to change your locks before the burglars even figured out what neighborhood you were in. But frontier AI has violently shrunk that window. We are now talking about the gap between a vulnerability being exposed and actively exploited collapsing from months down to literal minutes. It's a terrifying reality, and it renders traditional slow-moving defensive postures completely obsolete.
And this unprecedented acceleration leads us straight into our next section, the expanding confidence gap. Because this speed isn't just a technical hurdle anymore.
It is actively ripping open a very dangerous gap in trust and readiness across modern organizations. Grounding this reality, Terry's article points directly to the recent joint Five Eyes statement. Now, we know the Five Eyes is pretty much the heavyweight champion of global cyber intelligence. So when their joint statement makes it undeniably clear that this is a documented, systemic shift in the threat landscape, well, we need to listen. This isn't just some theoretical fear-mongering, it's a globally recognized crisis demanding immediate, decisive executive action to close that expanding gap. And here is the absolute crucial takeaway from Terry's article. Resilience is no longer a technical debate. It is a leadership obligation. I mean, really think about what that means for us. The critical failure point? It's moved. It's packed its bags, left the server room downstairs, and marched straight into the boardroom. You literally can't just buy another piece of software and assume you're safe. True resilience has been transformed into a non-negotiable, overarching duty for top-tier leadership. Which brings us to the next point, shrinking windows of vulnerability, with the time frame for reaction completely collapsing.
Relying on a traditional reactive approach to cyber defense is fundamentally broken. You simply cannot wait to be hit before figuring out your game plan. So the actual solution introduced in Terry's article is the framework of resilience by default. This is the core principle that technical controls alone, they are absolutely not enough anymore. Success now completely relies on getting the operational basics right, acting quickly, and crucially, proactively evidencing your readiness. Leaders have got to prove their authority and show disciplined operating behaviors under immense pressure way before an incident ever strikes. Resilience must be your default state, not some panic-induced afterthought.
And that requires a serious reality check, which we'll cover right now under Resilience as Leadership Obligation.
We really need to talk about the direct accountability of C-suite executives and board members in this AI-accelerated era. Look, if your organization is still treating cyber threats as a delegated IT problem, passing the buck to the chief information security officer while the board looks the other way, you are already massively behind the curve. AI-accelerated threats demand a complete pivot to systemic board ownership. The board literally cannot delegate the survival of the business. They must take direct, uncompromising ownership of systemic resilience.
In practice, taking systemic ownership means leaders have to demonstrate clarity, authority, and integrity long before an incident happens. Actually, scratch that. They have to live it daily. True resilience must be designed from the top down and actively governed. Because when a crisis hits, and in the age of frontier AI, let's face it, it will, that is the exact wrong time to figure out who's actually in charge and how your teams behave. You have to prove your disciplined behaviors under immense pressure by practicing them relentlessly beforehand.
So how do we actually go about doing that? That's the focus of our next section, evidencing operational assurance. How do leaders actually prove this readiness instead of just dangerously assuming it exists on some paper somewhere? Well, according to Terry's article, operational assurance is now the defining test of resilience. We are way past the days of having a thick binder of policies just gathering dust on a shelf. It requires leaders to categorically prove that their controls actually work in real-world conditions. And that means testing them under heavy load, testing them under immense pressure, and, incredibly importantly today, testing them amidst active misinformation. You've got to know your systems and your people will hold up when everything goes sideways.
To get that level of confidence, Terry's article maps out a few absolute non-negotiable requirements for boards to demand immediately. First up, continuous validation. It's not a once-a-year audit thing anymore, it's an ongoing process. Second, severe but plausible scenario testing. You've got to stress test your organization against realistic worst-case events. Think a simultaneous deepfake attack and a server wipe, not just the easy stuff. And third, defensible assurance across your suppliers and systemic dependencies. Because, let's be real, your resilience is only as strong as your weakest vendor. Boards simply have to demand these rigorous standards.
And that brings us to the core stakes of this whole explainer: avoiding avoidable future shocks. Because the consequences of failing to step up here are incredibly severe and tragically entirely avoidable. Both the Five Eyes agencies and Terry's article make it explicitly, unavoidably clear. Organizations that delay this shift, the ones that cannot demonstrate this operational assurance, are going to inevitably suffer massive self-inflicted damage. We're talking devastating operational downtime, catastrophic financial losses, and unrecoverable reputational shocks. If the board does not act now to mandate resilience by default, they are actively choosing to leave their organization completely exposed to AI-accelerated threats.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take straight back to your own boardrooms. Can your organization truly evidence its resilience under pressure today? Not just assume it, not hope for it, but critically evidence it. If the answer isn't an immediate and confident yes, then your leadership mandate is crystal clear, and the clock is ticking in minutes, not months. Podcast released every Tuesday on Spotify and YouTube. Like, subscribe, and repost. It helps us build the channel and focus on what's important to you.